The night of Amelia's corporate party felt surreal. It wasn't my usual scene. Fancy lighting, overpriced wine, and laughter that felt a little too rehearsed. Amelia had been distant lately, and I chalked it up to stress or the general wear and tear of married life. But that evening she seemed transformed. She had spent hours getting ready, slipping into a brand new dress I hadn't even seen her buy. It hugged her figure perfectly, shimmering under the chandelier lights as though she was the star of the night. Her eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen in months. Part of me wanted to believe she was doing it for me, like an unspoken apology for the weeks of tension. But another part of me, the quieter voice I didn't want to listen to, told me it wasn't about me at all. The venue was crowded, alive with chatter and clinking glasses, yet I felt like a ghost. Amelia flitted through the room with an energy that left me in her shadow. She introduced me to a few people, smiling politely, but her attention never lingered. Every time I tried to catch her eye, she was already moving on to someone else, as though I were another guest she'd forgotten to entertain. I lingered near the bar, a glass of wine in each hand, trying not to look like the awkward husband who didn't fit in. That's when Tom appeared. He was a tall guy with the kind of charm that felt too effortless, like he'd practiced his whole life for moments like this. His tie was loose, his cheeks flushed, and he carried that air of confidence that comes with a bit too much alcohol. He smiled at me and raised his drink, as if we were old friends. "First time at one of these?" he asked, his tone friendly but edged with amusement. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a polite chuckle. "Not exactly my scene." "Mine either," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "But you get used to it. These people, they love their little games." There was something in the way he said it, something that made me feel like he was testing the waters. I didn't respond, just sipped my wine and waited for him to fill the silence. "I'll tell you a secret," he said, leaning in slightly. "This job, it's not just about the work. It's about connections, you know? Some of those connections get personal." He smirked, as if he'd let me in on a private joke. I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where he was going with this. "Take me, for example," he continued. "I've been having an affair with someone here. Married woman. Can you believe that?" He laughed, shaking his head. "She's gorgeous. Absolutely stunning. But, complicated, you know? They always are." My stomach churned. At first, I thought he was just drunk, trying to impress a stranger with a bit of scandal. But there was something about the way he looked at me, like he was daring me to ask questions. I forced a laugh, trying to keep the conversation light. "Sounds messy." "Oh, it is," he said, his grin widening. "But that's part of the fun, isn't it? Keeps things interesting." I wanted to walk away, but his words rooted me in place. There was something unsettling about his tone, the way he seemed to relish the drama of it all. Amelia appeared in my peripheral vision, laughing with a group of coworkers on the other side of the room. She looked radiant, her face glowing as she leaned into their conversation. She didn't glance in my direction once. Tom followed my gaze and chuckled. "Looks like your wife is having a good time," he said. The comment was casual, but it hit me like a gut punch. I turned back to him, forcing a smile. "Yeah, she always does." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "Cheers to that, my friend." As he walked away, his words lingered, twisting in my mind. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was nothing more than drunken rambling. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Amelia barely came near me, too busy laughing and chatting with people whose names I'd already forgotten. By the time we left, the tension between us was palpable. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't care. As we drove home in silence, I couldn't stop replaying Tom's words. I wanted to believe they had nothing to do with me, with us. But something about the way Amelia had been acting lately, the way she drifted further and further away from me, made me wonder if I was just being naive. The days following the party felt heavier than usual. Amelia was more distant, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root after my conversation with Tom. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who doubted his wife over a few vague remarks. But little things started to pile up, one by one, until they were impossible to ignore. Amelia began coming home later than usual, claiming there was a surge of new projects at work. It wasn't out of character for her to stay late. She'd always been dedicated to her job, but something felt off. She didn't volunteer much about her day anymore, brushing off my questions with short, clipped answers. One evening, I noticed her phone sitting on the kitchen counter, screen dark. I picked it up, intending to check the time, but the screen didn't light up. It was locked, and when I tried her usual passcode, the one we'd both used for years, it didn't work. My heart sank. "Did you change your phone password?" I asked casually as she came into the kitchen. She glanced at me, her smile tight. "Oh yeah, work security stuff. They told us to update our passwords regularly. Nothing personal." I nodded, trying to hide my discomfort. It wasn't the explanation itself that bothered me. It was the way she said it, like she'd rehearsed it in her head before speaking. The next evening, she announced she'd be working late again. "Big client meeting tomorrow," she said, slipping into her coat. "I'll probably be home late, so don't wait up." I forced a smile. "Sure, don't overwork yourself." But as soon as she left, the knot in my stomach tightened. Her words didn't sit right. They felt too convenient, too perfect. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my keys and followed her. She drove further than I expected, heading out of the city limits toward a quieter part of town. I kept my distance, careful not to get too close. After about 25 kilometers, she pulled into the parking lot of a small bar. It wasn't the kind of place Amelia would normally go to, far from the polished wine bars she favored. This was a dimly lit, rough around the edges kind of spot, tucked away from the main road. I parked across the street, heart pounding as I watched her walk inside. She was wearing her usual work attire, but there was something different about the way she carried herself, an energy I couldn't quite place. I stayed in the car, debating my next move. Part of me wanted to storm in and confront her, demand an explanation for why she was here instead of at the office. But another part, the more cautious part, told me to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Just as I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake, that this was all some innocent detour, I saw him, Tom. He strode into the bar like he owned the place, his confident swagger unmistakable. My chest tightened as I watched him disappear through the door. The unease that had been gnawing at me since the party exploded into full-blown suspicion. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the entrance, my thoughts racing. What were the chances that they'd both end up at the same out-of-the-way bar, far from the office? It wasn't a coincidence. I couldn't believe that anymore. Minutes turned into an hour as I sat there, the glow of the bar's neon sign reflecting off my windshield. I considered going in, but the thought of what I might see stopped me. I wasn't ready for confirmation, not yet. Eventually, the door opened, and they stepped out together. Amelia was smiling, her body angled toward him as if drawn by some invisible magnet. Tom said something that made her laugh. A soft, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in weeks. They didn't touch, but the distance between them was too small, the kind of space where intimacy lingers, unspoken but palpable. I sank lower in my seat, my hands trembling as they walked to their separate cars. Amelia drove off first, and I waited a few minutes before following her home, careful to keep my distance. When we got back, she was already inside by the time I parked. I sat in the car, staring at the darkened windows of our house, the weight of what I'd just seen pressing down on me. It was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. It was a question of how much worse it was going to get. The decision to go inside wasn't a conscious one. It was like my body moved on its own, driven by some primal need for clarity. I couldn't sit in the car, watching and waiting, while Amelia laughed with him in some dark corner of that bar. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crossed the parking lot, every step heavier than the last. The bar was dimly lit, its walls covered in cheap wood paneling, and the air was thick with the smell of beer and stale cigarettes. The music was loud, a bass-heavy tune that rattled the windows and made conversation a challenge. My eyes scanned the room quickly, darting past groups of strangers until they landed on them. There they were, sitting in a corner booth near the back. Amelia was leaning forward, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Her hand rested lightly on Tom's, her fingers brushing against his knuckles in a gesture so casual, yet so intimate. They were both laughing, their heads tilted close together as if the rest of the world didn't exist. My stomach turned, the sight more painful than I had imagined. Seeing them like that made it real, more real than my suspicions, the late nights, or even the lies. It wasn't just a fleeting moment or an innocent coincidence. It was deliberate. I didn't think about what I was going to say or how I was going to approach them. The words formed in my throat, fueled by a mix of anger and heartbreak, and spilled out before I could stop them. "Amelia," I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "What's going on here?" Her reaction was instant. She froze, her face draining of color as she whipped around to face me. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The shock in her eyes gave way to panic, and I could see her struggling to come up with something to say, anything that might explain this away. But there was nothing. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't care what he had to say. His words didn't matter. Amelia finally found her voice, though it wavered. It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her hand pulling away from Tom's, as if that could somehow erase the moment I had just witnessed. I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Not what it looks like?" I said, my voice low and strained. "I think it's exactly what it looks like." She looked at Tom, then back at me, her expression shifting between guilt and desperation. "Nate, please, let's talk about this." "We're talking now." I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "What the hell is going on, Amelia? Why are you here with him?" Tom tried to interject, his voice calm but unwelcome. "Look, man, maybe we should step outside." "No," I snapped, my eyes never leaving Amelia's. "I'm not talking to you. This is between me and my wife." Tom leaned back, raising his hands in mock surrender, but his presence only fueled my anger. Amelia reached for my arm, her touch tentative, but I pulled away. Her attempts to defuse the situation felt hollow, like she wasn't trying to fix what was broken, just trying to keep me from breaking it further. "I can explain," she said, her voice trembling. I shook my head, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a crushing force. "Explain what, Amelia? Explain how you're holding hands with him in some bar while I sit at home wondering why you've been lying to me? Go ahead, explain that." She didn't answer. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. Confirmed everything I already knew but didn't want to believe. Tom started to say something again, but I wasn't listening anymore. My chest felt tight, and my vision blurred at the edges. I couldn't stand to be there a second longer. Without another word, I turned and walked out, the heavy door slamming shut behind me. The cold night air hit my face, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside me. My hands shook as I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. I sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The image of them together replayed in my mind on an endless loop, each repetition driving the knife deeper into my chest. I wanted to scream, to cry, to punch something, but I did none of those things. Instead, I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white and drove home in silence, the weight of betrayal sitting heavy on my shoulders. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt different. It wasn't the warm, safe place I thought it had always been. It was just walls and a roof, hollow and unfamiliar. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house as the reality of what I'd seen began to sink in. Amelia had betrayed me. She hadn't just lied or kept secrets. She had chosen someone else, someone who wasn't me. I didn't know what I was going to do, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after the bar felt like waking up in a stranger's life. I hadn't slept, my thoughts circling endlessly around what I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Amelia laughing with Tom flashed in my mind like a cruel reminder. By the time the sun rose, my decision was made. When Amelia came downstairs, she looked different. Her usual composure seemed cracked, her movements hesitant. She must have sensed the weight in the air, the unspoken tension that had settled over the house. "Morning," she said softly, her voice testing the waters. I didn't respond right away, just watched her pour herself a cup of coffee like it was any other day. She sat down across from me at the table, her eyes flickering nervously to meet mine. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. Her hand froze halfway to her mug. "About last night?" I nodded. "About everything." She set the mug down and leaned back in her chair, her shoulders slumping as though she'd already prepared herself for the worst. "Nate, I'm sorry," she began, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to say. I made a mistake." "A mistake," I repeated, my tone sharp. "Holding hands with him in a bar? Laughing with him like I wasn't even in the picture? That's not just a mistake, Amelia. That's a choice. A choice you made over and over again." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she reached for my hand. "I swear, Nate, it didn't mean anything. It was stupid and I wasn't thinking. Please, you have to believe me." I pulled my hand away, the touch too much to bear. "I don't have to believe anything, Amelia. I saw it. I saw you with him. You can't talk your way out of this." She broke into sobs, burying her face in her hands. "I love you," she choked out. "I love you, Nate. I never stopped loving you. Please, don't throw us away." Her words cut deep, but they felt hollow. How could she say she loved me while sneaking off to meet someone else? How could she claim to care when she'd lied to my face? "It's already gone, Amelia," I said quietly, the finality of my words hanging in the air. "You threw it away the moment you chose him over me." She shook her head violently, her tears flowing harder. No, that's not true. I was stupid, but it didn't mean anything. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. Fix what's broken." I stood, cutting her off. "There's no fixing this. I can't trust you anymore. Every word you say feels like a lie, and I can't live like that." Her sobs turned into pleading. "Please, Nate, please don't do this. Don't throw us away. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job. I'll never see him again. I'll do whatever it takes." Her desperation was painful to watch, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't about Tom anymore. It was about the trust she'd shattered, the foundation of our life together that had crumbled beneath her choices. "I want you to pack your things and leave," I said, my voice resolute. "We don't have kids, Amelia. There's nothing tying us together anymore." Her face crumpled, and she clutched at my arm as though holding on could keep us from falling apart. "Don't do this," she begged. "We've built so much together. Please, let me make it right." I gently pulled away, my heart aching despite my resolve. "It's too late. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." For a long moment, she sat there, her sobs echoing in the silence of the kitchen. Then, slowly, she nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. "I'll go," she whispered. I watched as she stood, her movements mechanical, and disappeared upstairs. The sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of bags being packed. It all felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold. When she finally came back down, her suitcase in hand, she looked at me one last time. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm so sorry, Nate," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll always love you." I didn't respond. Couldn't. I just opened the door and watched her step outside, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. When the door closed behind her, the silence was deafening. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where she'd been, the reality of her absence slowly sinking in. It was over. Amelia was gone, and so was the life we'd built together. After Amelia left, the house felt impossibly quiet. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, a constant reminder of everything that had been lost. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. The days blurred together, filled with long stretches of sitting in the same chair, staring at the same walls, replaying everything that had happened. The betrayal felt like an open wound, raw and unrelenting, but I knew I couldn't stay in that place forever. One morning, as I sat nursing my coffee, I decided I needed to change something, anything. So, I laced up my old running shoes, the ones gathering dust in the back of the closet, and stepped outside. The air was brisk, the kind that bit at your lungs but made you feel alive. I started running, slow and unsteady at first, my legs protesting every step. The first mile was torture, but as I pushed on, something shifted. The rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, the steady cadence of my breathing. It all began to drown out the noise in my head. For the first time in weeks, my thoughts quieted, and all that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other. The next day I ran again, and the day after that. It became my routine, something to anchor me when everything else felt adrift. Each morning, I ran a little farther, pushing past the limits I thought I had. It wasn't just about the physical challenge. It was about reclaiming control, proving to myself that I could still move forward. After a few weeks, I signed up for a 10-mile marathon. It was a big leap, but I needed something to work toward, a goal to keep me focused. Training for it became my escape, the long runs clearing my head and giving me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Outside of running, I started reaching out to old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years because of how consumed I'd been by my relationship with Amelia. One of them was Derek, my college roommate. We hadn't talked much since I got married, but when I called him, he picked up immediately, like no time had passed. "About time you remembered I exist," he joked, his voice warm and familiar. We met up for beers that weekend, and it was like stepping back into a part of my life I'd almost forgotten. Derek didn't push for details about Amelia, though I could tell he wanted to. Instead, we talked about everything else: work, old college stories, the ridiculous pranks we used to pull. For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. A real, unforced laugh that didn't feel like it was hiding anything. Derek introduced me to some of his friends, too, a mix of people who welcomed me into their circle without hesitation. We started meeting up regularly: barbecues, game nights, even a spontaneous camping trip. Being around them reminded me of something I'd lost with Amelia. The ability to just be myself, no pretense, no walking on eggshells. The more I poured into my hobbies and friendships, the less space Amelia's betrayal took up in my mind. It wasn't that I stopped thinking about her entirely. How could I? But the pain started to dull, like a faded scar that no longer hurt when you touched it. The marathon day eventually came, and as I lined up at the starting line, surrounded by hundreds of other runners, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: pride. Not for anyone else, not to prove anything, but for myself. I'd worked for this moment, pushed through the pain and the doubts, and now here I was, ready to run those 10 miles. The race itself was grueling, but every step felt like a victory. When I crossed the finish line, exhausted and drenched in sweat, a wave of emotion hit me. It wasn't just the joy of finishing. It was the realization that I could still set goals, still achieve things, still live. That night, as I sat on the couch with an ice pack on my knee and a medal around my neck, I thought about how far I'd come. The man I was when Amelia walked out of that door felt like a different person. Broken, lost, unsure of everything. But now I was starting to rebuild piece by piece. Life wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine again, and that was enough. 2 weeks after Amelia left, I was beginning to feel like I was finally regaining control of my life. The days were still hard, but they weren't as suffocating as before. I kept myself busy, running, spending time with friends, and filling my time with anything that didn't leave room for the past to creep in. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening the door. When I did, I froze. Standing on my doorstep was Tom. He looked terrible. His normally confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something fragile and broken. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and drawn, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept in days. "Nate," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you?" Every instinct in me screamed to slam the door in his face, but curiosity, and maybe a lingering desire for answers, stopped me. I stepped back and let him in, though I didn't offer him a seat. He stood awkwardly in the entryway, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly, as if sensing my hesitation. I needed to say something." I crossed my arms, keeping my voice cold. "Then say it." He nodded, taking a shaky breath. "I want to apologize. For everything. For Amelia. For the mess I've caused in your life." I stared at him, unimpressed. "You didn't show up here to apologize, Tom. What do you want?" His shoulders sagged further, and he looked down at the floor. "I wanted to admit that I was wrong. That what we did was wrong." He glanced up at me, his eyes desperate. "She lied to me, Nate. She told me your marriage was over, that you didn't care about her, that you'd already given up. I believed her. I was stupid and I fell for it. But I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Didn't know that sneaking around with a married woman was wrong? Didn't know that you were destroying someone else's life? Save it, Tom." He flinched at my words, but he didn't fight back. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have known better. I should have walked away the moment she told me about you. But I didn't. And now here I am, standing in the wreckage of everything I thought I wanted." I shook my head, the bitterness in my chest twisting tighter. "You don't get to play the victim here. You made your choices, Tom. You knew she was married. You knew what you were doing." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "And I hate myself for it. I hate what I did to you, to her, to myself. I needed you to know that I see it now. That I'm sorry." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to decide if his apology was genuine or just another performance. His misery seemed real, but it didn't matter. It wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't undo the pain. "It won't change anything," I said finally, my voice cold and unyielding. "You both made your choices, and now you have to live with them." He nodded, his expression crumpling under the weight of my words. "I understand," he murmured. I hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me someday." "Don't count on it," I replied, stepping back toward the door. Tom hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but he seemed to think better of it. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his head bowed like a man defeated. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The encounter left me shaken, not because of his apology, but because of the reminder of everything I'd worked so hard to move past. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer. Not to him, not to Amelia. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as I stood there in the quiet of my house, I realized something else. I didn't need their apologies to move on. Their choices were theirs to live with, just as mine were mine. I wasn't going to let their mistakes define me anymore. That part of my life was over. It was time to keep moving forward. Filing for divorce felt like stepping out of a suffocating room and finally being able to breathe. The papers weren't just a legal formality. They were a declaration that I was ready to let go of the past. There was no point in holding on to something that had already crumbled. When I signed my name, it was with a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what could have been, and relief that I no longer had to carry the weight of a broken relationship. After that, I started clearing out everything that reminded me of Amelia. Her pictures came down first, tucked into a box I didn't plan to open again. Her clothes, her trinkets, the little notes she used to leave me. Everything went. Even the gifts she'd given me over the years felt tainted, like they belonged to a version of us that no longer existed. Letting go of those things wasn't easy, but each item I packed away or threw out lightened the load on my shoulders. The house started to feel different, like it was finally mine again. I rearranged the furniture, bought new sheets, and even painted the living room a different color. It was a small change, but it made a big difference. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was creating a space where I could heal and move forward. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years. Lauren. She was an old friend from college, someone I'd always been close to but had lost touch with over the years. She looked almost the same, her warm smile as familiar as ever. "Nate," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Lauren," I replied, equally shocked. We stood there for a moment, taking each other in before breaking into laughter. It was the kind of laugh that felt easy, like no time had passed. "What's it been, 10 years?" she asked, shaking her head. "You look the same but older, if that makes sense." I chuckled. "I could say the same about you." The conversation flowed naturally from there, light and casual, like we were picking up right where we'd left off. We caught up on each other's lives, talking about work, family, and everything in between. I told her about the divorce, not in detail, but enough for her to understand. She didn't pry, just nodded and offered a sympathetic smile. "Sounds like you've been through a lot," she said softly. "Yeah," I admitted, "but I'm getting through it, one step at a time." We exchanged numbers before parting ways, promising to catch up soon. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about seeing her again stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, we started meeting up more often. First, it was just coffee or lunch. Nothing serious, just two old friends reconnecting. But the more time we spent together, the more I found myself looking forward to those moments. Lauren had this way of making everything feel lighter, easier. She never pressured me to talk about things I wasn't ready to share, but she listened when I needed to. And when I laughed with her, it wasn't forced or hollow. It was real. I wasn't sure what was happening between us, but I didn't feel the need to define it. For now, it was enough to enjoy her company, to feel my heart start to open up again, little by little. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the water, she turned to me with a smile. "You seem different," she said. "Different how?" I asked, curious. "Lighter," she said after a moment. "Happier. Like you're finally letting go of something that's been weighing you down." I looked out at the water, her words sinking in. She was right. I did feel lighter, happier. For so long, I'd been carrying the burden of betrayal and loss, but now, it felt like that weight was finally lifting. "Maybe I am," I said, turning back to her. She smiled, and in that moment, I realized that the future didn't have to be something to fear. It could be something to look forward to, something full of possibility. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to move on. Not just from Amelia, but from the version of myself that had been trapped in the past. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and choosing to live anyway. And with Lauren by my side, even as just a friend for now, it felt like the start of something new, something good. Looking back now, I can see that the betrayal, as devastating as it was, taught me a lesson I never knew I needed. In the beginning, it felt like my entire world had been ripped apart, like the foundation of my life had crumbled beneath me. But in that destruction, I found something unexpected: clarity. Losing someone you trust so completely is like having a piece of yourself torn away. It's disorienting, painful, and humbling. But it's also a wake-up call, one that forces you to confront the things you've been avoiding, not just in the other person, but in yourself. Amelia's betrayal cut me deeply, but it also stripped away the illusions I had built around her and our relationship. I'd spent so much time trying to hold on to something that wasn't real, convincing myself that things would get better if I just worked harder, loved more, or sacrificed more of myself. But the truth was, I'd been giving to someone who wasn't willing to give back. As hard as it was to accept, her actions weren't a reflection of me. They were hers alone, and no amount of love or effort on my part could have changed that. It wasn't my job to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. In losing her, I found myself. I rediscovered the things that made me happy, the passions and friendships I had set aside in the name of a relationship that wasn't worth the cost. I learned to stand on my own 2 feet again, to find joy in the little things, and to trust myself in ways I hadn't before. More importantly, I realized that I deserved better. Better than lies, better than manipulation, better than someone who didn't value what I had to offer. I promised myself that I would never again let someone take advantage of my trust or make me feel like I wasn't enough. Betrayal leaves scars, But scars are proof that you've healed. They're reminders of what you've been through, but also of what you've overcome. Mine remind me of the strength I didn't know I had, the resilience that carried me through the darkest days, and the clarity that came when I finally chose myself. I don't look back on my time with Amelia with anger anymore. The pain is still there, but it's dulled, like an echo of something that no longer defines me. She was a chapter in my life, a chapter filled with lessons I'll carry with me, but not one I'll let hold me back. Now, as I stand on the edge of this new beginning, I feel hopeful. Hopeful for the future, for the people I've reconnected with, and for the person I've become. The road ahead is still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a new one, and this time I'm writing it on my terms.